Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome APTA Legislative and Executive Committee member and Mid-Atlantic Division President, HNTB, Diana Mendez.
Good afternoon, APTA friends and colleagues. Welcome to the general session with the Federal Transit Administration. You all having a great conference? Awesome. So this afternoon, we're going to be hearing from two of FTA's senior leaders, Executive Director Matt Welbas and Vincent Valdez, who is the Associate Administrator for FTA's Office of Research, Demonstration, and Innovation. We're going to start out hearing from Matt Welbas. As FTA's Executive Director, Matt directs the daily operations of the agency and provides leadership and direction for policies, budgets, and strategic priorities. In that role, Matt guides the management of the agency's $13 billion annual budget and the 550 people who work with FTA's stakeholders. Please help me in giving a warm welcome to Executive Director Matt Welbas.
Thank you, Diana. Appreciate that welcome. Whether we're dealing with planning matters or environmental reviews or, I guess, reauthorization conversations at APTA, I always figure when I see you, things are going to be okay and we're going to make a lot of progress. And I'm glad to be joining you all here today in Louisville. I also want to thank Paul Skatelis and his team from APTA, particularly for sort of reimagining what we need to do in 2019 and establishing the mobility conference that we're attending. And then I also want to thank the people of TARC, Executive Director Ferdinand Risco and his team for hosting us. TARC has been an important partner for FTA over the years, rolling out some of the initial low and no emission vehicles, building out a BRT line, and I know there's more success like that ahead in the future. And this morning I was really glad to see retired TARC executive Barry Barker. And I met Barry early in my career as I was participating in a transit cooperative research program study. And Barry, as he said this morning, you know, he had friends in the audience and friends he hadn't met yet. And that really was a true statement about who he is. And for Barry, as a partner with the Federal Transit Administration, he was really important. He, over time, he chaired the FTA-funded and APTA-managed TCRP TOPS Committee. Barry chaired the FTA-funded National Transit Institute. He was the chair of the FTA-funded and TRB-managed Transit Research Analysis Committee. So, you know, in short, he was really helping FTA carry out our 6-word mission, which is to improve public transportation for America's communities. And over the years, Barry and I would talk, and we talk about music in addition to transportation, and he's the one person I think I've ever met who was actually in 1969 at Woodstock. And I was thinking, I don't think he's here this afternoon, but if his experience of the crushing traffic congestion there led him into a public transportation career, perhaps. But most importantly, his 25-year mission was being here in Louisville, making sure people had a great place to live. And I think it's kind of fitting that we're holding this inaugural mobility conference here in Louisville. And it's because it's where Barry worked to ensure people had access to opportunity. And when he was retiring last fall, he said, "I've always been motivated by the belief that the quality of life in our communities is only as good as it is for the least advantaged members of our communities. And access to life's opportunities is a must if communities and individuals are to thrive." And so it's helpful to look at all the new technology and services through Barry Barker's eyes, perhaps. And Barry might ask us, how do we make these new technologies a servant instead of a master? And how can innovation support neighborhoods that people will cherish? And how can transportation improve people's lives and bring everyone in the community along for the trip? And so at DOT, innovation is one of our 4 DOT strategic plan priorities. And you are here as transit proponents, as innovators, and I think your imagination and your ideas are really turned into the trips for people that meet important needs. And because we're at the American Public Transportation Association's first mobility conference, it's a moment to ask, what is public transportation? And so, we can all recognize some of the services around our country that are public transportation, right? That's streetcars in New Orleans, it can be passenger ferries in Maine, subway lines in Chicago. Paul Skatelis or Catherine Egan could tell you about the funiculars in Pittsburgh. And they're all public transportation, and perhaps most importantly, bus service. The bus service you see here in Louisville and in thousands of other communities around the country. And what do they have in common? Well, it's people sharing rides. It's on service that's regular and continuing. Think of that bus that comes every 10 minutes. And the service is open to the public, so everybody can ride. And that's actually the definition. If you open up federal law, that's the definition of public transportation that's in federal law. So it's people sharing rides on a regular service that's open to everyone. And this is the kind of service that supports about 30 million trips a day. So that's what the Federal Transit Program funds. Now, there are two other types. I think, as you all know, there are two other types of service that the Federal Transit Program funds as well. One is ADA paratransit, service for people who cannot access those fixed route services. And there's also, in federal law, non-ADA paratransit, specialized services that are open to everybody, to a segment of the public, rather, age, disability, low income. And so at the Mobility Conference, what we're doing is we're really bringing together those of you who are public transportation providers with some new services that may or may not be public transportation, but together, public transportation and these services really have the potential to be complementary and mutually beneficial. And it's especially important, we're learning, for those first and last mile connections, whether it's a scooter, a dock bike, maybe a tuk-tuk, as Mayor Fisher noted this morning. And for the Federal Transit Administration, our job is to be your partner in navigating this new mobility. So we're a funder. We test some of these tools with you. And we're in this period of some notable experimentation or opportunities for experimentation. And we want to support all of you figuring out what works. Most of the new services, as you've probably observed, tend to emerge and operate around fixed route transit services and the land uses that they created. In the same way that sort of Louisville grew up around the Ohio River, those new services tend to appear in the public transportation ecosystem, right? And so today, in our $70 billion public transportation industry, the FTA provides a little less than 20% of all the funding. When it comes to the capital spending, the Federal Transit Program is a bigger contributor. It's about 35% of all the spending. But beyond our capital funding, our operating funding, our support for industry research is perhaps the most precious resource we have. And so just 2 weeks ago, FTA announced our Integrated Mobility Innovation Grant Program, or our IMI program. It's $15 million, and it's available to support really new ways of thinking about public transportation service, payment services, and automation, all with an eye toward improving mobility. And my colleague, Vince Valdez, is going to tell us more about that in a moment. But as I'm speaking, I want to share with you a video about our IMI program.
FTA's $15 million Integrated Mobility Innovation Demonstration Program will fund projects that transform the traveler experience by developing and deploying technologies that improve mobility across all modes of travel. Recognizing continued interest in innovative transportation options, FTA launched the program to expand mobility on-demand research, incorporate transit automation research, and further explore payment integration to enable accessibility and easier travel for all. FTA will fund projects that demonstrate innovative approaches and technologies that increase efficiency, promote safety, and enhance the traveler's experience. Recently, FTA invested $8 million in 11 mobility on-demand projects to test technologies and solutions that provide an innovative approach to improving mobility and connections to public transportation. For example, the San Francisco Bay Area Rapid Transit District tackled the problem of overcrowded station parking lots by partnering with a carpooling app to match transit commuters. With the promise of a guaranteed parking space at BART stations, the app allows travelers to easily find carpooling partners. Recently, BART debuted the program at one station. Now the program is linked to 17 stations and has matched over 100,000 trips. In Florida, the Pinellas Suncoast Transit Authority is focused on improving its paratransit service. With the region's population of older adults soaring, the agency received funding for a program to link taxis and car sharing to its paratransit program to provide more cost-effective door-to-door service through an on-demand dispatch system. Since the program began in 2018, paratransit ridership has grown every month. Transit agencies continue to explore and embrace automation. As part of the Integrated Mobility Innovation Initiative, FTA will fund the development of automation technologies in bus transit, such as driver assistance systems and self-driving shuttles. The program also will support agencies working to integrate payment systems across their services, as well as with other mobility service providers such as bike share, ride share, scooters, and micro-transit. As public transportation continues to experience rapid change, FTA's Integrated Mobility Innovation Grants will help transit providers throughout the country develop and deploy technologies to better serve their customers and usher in a new age of transit innovation.
So we encourage you to apply for IMI grants. We've got a 90-day period for applying, and that's because we want to give people some time to think through what their applications might look like. So the application deadline is August 6th, but you're welcome to apply sooner. It is competitive grant season at FTA right now. So right now there are 4 FTA requests for proposals that are out on the street. In addition to the $15 million for the IMI program, there's $4 million for the Public Transportation Safety and Crime Prevention Program. Applications are due next week, the 28th of May. There's the $423 million Bus and Bus Facilities Program. I'd note that that amount is $160 million higher than the FAST Act authorized level, which highlights the demand for this program. Yep. And those applications are due June 21st. And then there's $5 million available for the Tribal Transit Program, with applications due on July 9th. Our FTA Director of Grant Programs, Kim Sledge, is here with us in the audience. And she's just here in Louisville briefly, resting, answering some of your questions. And then when she heads back to DC, she'll deal with probably $2 billion plus of grant applications that you and people in the industry will send in. We've gotten to a point where when we're working on our competitive grant reviews, Kim and her team print the information for discussion on large poster-sized paper because we have material to review. Maybe the audience is getting older. But when she shows up, it could be me too, when Kim shows up with these large packages, Secretary Chow, our acting administrator, Jane Williams, know we're about to have a conversation about FTA competitive programs because that's the scale of the endeavor. Our most recent effort to promote safety in the industry does align with one of Secretary Chow's top priorities for DOT, one of the 4, and it's safety. And so in the NOFO issued last month, our Safety and Crime Prevention Notice of Funding Opportunity, it included resources to support prevention of transit operator assault and prevention of human trafficking. And I think we all know that recent news reminds us how important this endeavor is. And then the funding is available for a large range of transit safety investments. So I do encourage you to look at that NOFO and consider applying. And then for the Bus and Bus Facilities Program, just for context, last year we allocated $366 million to 107 projects in 52 states and territories. Here in Kentucky, the Kentucky Transportation Cabinet received $7 million, and that was for service in the state to replace vehicles, construct and renovate new facilities, and the application had highlighted that there were employment needs that needed to be met, particularly in rural areas, and there are significant populations of seniors. So that service is going to be really critical for meeting people's mobility and independence and quality of life needs. Soon, you'll see another request for proposals, probably late spring, early summer, and that's for the Transit-Oriented Development Pilot Program. And I would suggest you look carefully at that one. So over the last 40 years, FTA has helped build almost 2,000 rail and bus rapid transit stations around the country. And those are places where neighborhoods emerge, literally changing the face of our country. And the TOD pilot program supports innovation and planning for these high-capacity transit, rail, and BRT lines. So something happened last year that I can't recall happening for an FTA competitive grant program. We had more dollars available than was the amount proposed in the applications. That never happens in one of our programs. And so if you have a high-capacity corridor and you need to do some planning along the line, you should seriously consider the TOD pilot program request for proposals that will be coming out in a few weeks. We will have $19 million available for the 2019 solicitation. And then likewise, I encourage applications for the DOT build program. So it's a program that's administered by the department. Transit projects are an important part of that mix. Last December, there were $160 million in build grants given to transit projects. And my acting administrator, Jane Williams, asked me to ask you to look at that NOFO and apply. Those applications are due July 15th. There's $900 million available there. And then I think within the next week or two, we anticipate that the appropriations committees in Congress will begin marking up FY 2020 funding. And for context, the DOT budget to Congress for 2020 proposed an additional $250 million for the competitive bus program, proposed an additional $250 million for the State of Good Repair program. Those are amounts above the amounts that were authorized in the FAST Act for 2020. And it highlights that we need investments in transportation infrastructure, both to reduce the State of Good Repair backlog, but also to prepare for the future. We need to walk and chew gum at the same time, right? And it's also important to highlight that for the first time in 3 years, the DOT budget to Congress included additional funding for new capital investment grants projects. That's a policy change, and it helps support capacity we're going to need. The Census Bureau says we're going to have 42 million additional people in the United States by 2040. That's 380 million folks. It's like adding, I think I looked at about 33 Louisville metro areas to our country in the next 20 years. And to do that, we're going to have to share some rides, right, to make that work in our communities. And so over the past 2 years, we've allocated $5 billion for CIG projects to 22 new CIG projects that are moving forward right now. So I want you to have that for context as you watch the Congress mark up the 2020 appropriation. And then just to close, as I noted earlier, for FTA, we just have a simple 6-word mission: improve public transportation for America's communities. And while that's our mission, we don't hire any drivers, we don't have any construction equipment, we don't own any buses or trains. And so we really accomplish that in partnership with all of you. I think you've heard me highlight this before, but it bears repeating. So the partnership that we have with all of you, managing about $70 billion in active grants, managing a $13 billion or so appropriation annually, is critical. And we look forward to participating in many more APTA mobility conferences in the years ahead. So thank you very much. I now get to bring up on stage to join me FTA's Associate Administrator for Research, Demonstration, and Innovation, Vince Valdez. And some of you may know that Vince, prior to joining the public transportation industry, was in the aerospace industry, and he is literally a rocket scientist.
Oh, please.
Yep. And so, when we're at FTA and we have a problem, if somebody says, well, this is going to require rocket scientists, we're ready. But, more than that, in addition to knowing how to launch stuff into space at a high velocity, Vince knows how to safely move people on the ground at high speed, at human speed, creating places that people are going to want to be, and creating better information for them, creating cleaner technologies. He's just been a real valuable person that my acting administrator, Jane Williams, and I rely on repeatedly. Back in 2012, when we created our new safety program after Congress gave us additional responsibilities, it was Vince who stepped out of his research role to lead the startup of that endeavor because he was the right person to make that happen. And I'm very grateful to have him on our FTA team, and he's going to share a bit more about some of the innovative things that we have underway at the FTA.
Thank you very much.
Yep.
Thank you so much.
Yep.
Thank you. You know, rocket science is much easier than this, right? Actually, thanks very much, and I want to thank Paul and David for inviting me to speak today as well. I mean, there's nothing better than speaking at an inaugural event, and here being part of APTA Mobility is fantastic, and part of the mission of TRI and the research office back at FTA. I want to talk to you a little bit about IMI. I think you already saw the film. Thank you, Matt, for showing the film and for demonstrating what IMI is about. But I want to talk a little bit more about some of the details of IMI and what we envision for IMI. I think the best way to really describe IMI is that it's the next evolution of FTA's Mobility on Demand program, which I know you all remember from back in 2016. IMI was set up really to advance a vision for a safe and seamless and reliable transportation network for every traveler, regardless of their circumstance or their situation or their ability. And think about what that means in people's lives, because again, this is about people. It's an evolution because IMI brings together the Mobility on Demand sandbox, as I mentioned, our Strategic Transit Automation Research Program, and the very important area of mobility payment integration, the idea that this is all integrated through payment and through planning. And it brings it into a single $15 million funding opportunity, which is, again, encouraging people to think creatively about how to put these proposals together. You're all aware that US DOT and FTA have been promoting a vision for innovative mobility that builds on research efforts in accessible transportation technologies, advanced mobility management, demand management, as well as the safe adoption of automation. The vision also depends on public-private partnerships that will enhance mobility options for all travelers, including travelers with disabilities, travelers from rural areas, lower-income travelers, and certainly older Americans as well. There are 4 basic guiding principles that we've really baked into the IMI program. As with Mobility on Demand, it's really focused on the user. It promotes choice in personal mobility and uses universal design principles to satisfy the needs of all travelers. It's mode neutral in that it encourages connectivity and interoperability. It's a vision where all transportation modes are working together to achieve efficient movement and optimizing those very precious transportation resources. It's technology enabled. It uses emerging and existing technologies to enable and incentivize smart decisions by all travelers and transportation operators in a given mobility ecosystem. And finally, and this is extraordinarily important, you really do need to focus on this, it's driven by partnerships. It inspires strong working relationships between public and private sectors to accelerate innovation and stimulate deployment of mobility solutions for the benefit of everyone. Matt just showed you the video, and I think you saw that IMI is fundamentally grounded in this vision of a complete trip, and I put that in quotes. And let me ask you to think of the complete trip in this way. The real quality of any transportation system is basically its ability to allow a person to go from their starting point to their destination without any disruptions in their travel chain. Very simple. From the moment that you plan a trip to the point where you're boarding a vehicle and even maybe transferring to another mode or another vehicle if you need to, and ultimately arriving at your destination, every link in that travel chain has to be accessible, easy to use, dependable, and has to be completed predictably and reliably. And even if you can complete the trip, and if it was inconvenient or undependable or burdensome in any way, that's a major barrier that may be a disincentive to using that system in the future. Because at the end of the day, we all rightfully value our time and convenience no matter who we are or what our circumstances are. As we did with the original Mobility on Demand sandbox, we know that transit plays well in this environment, and will continue to play a central role in integrated mobility. Transit has always been a key link in the travel chain and will continue to provide complete trips for decades to come. Our view is that the IMI program will help transit agencies bring partners to the table to deliver complete trips in new and even better ways. One thing I can tell you from my time at the research office is that at FTA is that we've never been disappointed in the creativity of the transit industry. And I know we're going to see some very exciting proposals and imaginative ideas from the transit industry in terms of our IMI solicitation. I'm looking forward to questions as we enter into this, and I do encourage you to not just wait till to August 6th, because that would really be terrible for us. We'll see a tsunami of proposals coming in. Try to think about what you want to say early, and we look forward to working with you. Thank you very much.
So we're now to thank you for those remarks. Very inspiring, lots of hope and opportunity, which we can now explore through our question and answer session. So I'd like to take the moderator's prerogative and ask the first question before inviting others from the audience. And I'd like to start with the Integrated Mobility Innovation Program that FTA just released. So it includes eligibility in several areas: mobility on demand, automation, and fare payment. Can you share with us some of FTA's top priorities in looking forward and looking to what would be attractive submittals?
Absolutely. I think the true core of the IMI was really to promote innovative thinking around how to integrate a network, how to perhaps use tools such as MPI or multimodal fare payment and automation to support a concept of operations in mobility on demand. So it's really exploring how you enact a new, or you develop a new model for providing service and supporting that service with new technologies. And again, the idea is that you have access to all of these resources in one notice of funding. Great.
Very exciting program, and certainly bodes well for a bright future for transit. So thank you for sharing. So I'm going to ask one more question. So this is your reprieve, so you can all be thinking about your questions. So next one up has to do with, we've just wrapped up another infrastructure week, and with it, all the calls for more investment in infrastructure, including, of course, public transportation. So APTA is strongly supporting these bipartisan efforts, and we'd like to know how we can work together to find a way to pay for an infrastructure package and get the issue across the finish line. Any ideas you'd like to share with us and how we can help?
Yeah, Dan, you know, it's interesting, not just in our transportation world, but in the world of infrastructure. You can read on the front page of the paper that our president and leaders in Congress are having this conversation about infrastructure. And so it is one of the areas of comparative consensus, right? So it's an area where in Washington, D.C., there is the potential for a path forward at a moment when people always don't see a lot of paths forward. And having said that, there's not anyone in our country who knows exactly how that's going to play out. But I'm an optimist, and I think it highlights the potential that exists. It also means that APTA, as you've been doing, needs to be articulate about your vision for the public transportation portion of an infrastructure package, whether it's a broad infrastructure package or a surface transportation reauthorization. For those of you who followed these things over time, they tend not to go step A, B, C. They go, A, R, J, then C. But it's a moment for people to stay in communication. It's a moment for people to be articulate about their interests. It's certainly a topic that we're focused on at DOT right now as we head toward the conclusion of the Fast Act authorization period.
Great. So it's now your turn. Are you going to make me call on people? Somebody must have a question. Come on up.
Okay, so when I was at the Rapid, we built a BRT, but we didn't have this tool that you created later, which was this transit-oriented development planning grant that we could use with the cities. And that's a brand new thing, and you talked about it again. So my question is, what are you envisioning in moving in this direction? What is it that you seek to accomplish at the FTA as opposed to what is really happening in the cities?
Yeah, we want to support. We've seen over time, I think, in my time in the industry, I've seen the moment from when a transit station is planned to when it's built, to when we start to see development occur around those stations, the period has become shorter. And it's because the real estate industry, other people involved have become more sophisticated about understanding the opportunity that exists around a public transportation station. Having said that, there's a lot more we can do and learn when it comes to corridor planning and station area planning and getting the zoning right, making sure that the objectives that a given community has for a station area are met. And so this is some supplemental money that's available to help our grantees grow around their transit stations. As I say, there's 2,000 transit stations that UMPT and FTA have helped build over the last 40 years. And so we really see it as an opportunity to help our grantees be thoughtful about growing around those stations.
Well, thank you for doing it.
Yeah. And thank you all for considering applying.
Good afternoon. Kim Williams of Houston Metro. Just a follow-up question on the ME program. 2 questions. You talked about public-private partnerships. In the grant application, what's your thought about having vendors a part of that, or is it your expectation that the concept would be introduced and then we would do a competitive bid after award if given the opportunity? So that's the first question.
Well, our relationship is obviously always with the transit agencies, but in this case, we're encouraging the proposals to come with partnerships that have been defined before actually putting the idea together. I think that gives you a more fulsome approach in terms of the concept of operations that you're trying to promote, the technologies that you're trying to prove out in terms of any kind of a proposal or demonstration.
Okay. And the second question, is there anticipated to be a cap for an award to particular states?
We don't have caps in mind for this. We realize that there needs to be flexibility, but we don't have any defined caps at this point.
Great. Well, thank you for the opportunity. Appreciate it.
If you don't come up, I'm going to call on you. Thank you, Doug.
Good afternoon. Doug Tisdale, chairman of the board of the RTD in Denver. And I guess what I want to start with is a thank you, because we have had a phenomenal partnership with the FTA and what we've been able to do at RTD in Denver. And we just opened up our G line, which is a commuter rail line out to the west side. And then on Friday last week, we opened up the extension of our EF&R line, our light rail line to the southeast. And I had the privilege of introducing Cindy Terwilliger, who's the Region 8 administrator there at the event. And I was able to say to people, here's a person who, when she comes into the room, she really means it when she says, I'm from the federal government and I'm here to help. And we are very appreciative for that. And I do want to applaud especially all of the initiatives relative to capturing value around transit-oriented development. We look at Union Station in Denver, and we had an opportunity to see the very lovely Union Station here in Louisville, but our Union Station is a true transit hub. We run Amtrak through there, we run our commuter rail through there, we run our buses through there, the BRT, and we have the light rail station just beyond. That all happened because of our collaboration with FTA. And I do want to encourage that continuing effort, and I'm wondering if you have any words of inspiration for others on how they might look at our model and carry that through into other cities.
Yeah, Doug, I just want to say congratulations on the opening. So the projects that he's referring to were part of a FTA Capital Investment Grant project, a public-private partnership, and Cindy, working with Dave Genova, was so happy to see that opening occur. It's a real accomplishment. And when you talk about Denver Union Station, I think many of you know it's one of the shining examples of use of FTA funds. So there's a Tiger, now a Build grant that helped fund that. There was a DOT TIFIA loan that helped facilitate that. I think it was paid off early because of the revenue that was generated from that project. It's one type of a value capture endeavor. There's a variety of ways. There's actually a statutory definition of value capture. I think our acting administrator, Jane Williams, has been talking about it in a much broader sense, looking at the different streams of revenue that public transportation agencies have available to them. And so it's useful to highlight that. We are talking about some ways that we might provide more technical assistance to our grantees to facilitate their thinking and identifying their opportunities for value capture. Yeah.
Thank you.
Come on up, Dave.
All right. It's tough to follow that voice.
I know.
Yeah.
That's a great voice.
This is a bit of an open-ended question, Vince. Maybe beyond the interesting things in service delivery and models that you're talking about, what are some of the technical innovations in vehicles, communication systems, some of the things that I know your office is doing?
Yeah, we're very interested, obviously, in alternative energy or alternative propulsion systems, and we see that as having a role, particularly in this new paradigm of service provision. We're interested in new communications technologies, new trip planning technologies, fare payment technologies, and then the suite of technologies that support safer transportation, safer bus transportation specifically, driver assistance, precision docking, technologies that will support throughput in a system as well as will improve the safety. So that's kind of the ideas behind the technologies, again, because we're a very small program by comparison, first of all, to all of FTA, but also by comparison to other research programs. We don't really spend a lot of time in developing technologies in a granular way or specifically in our shop, but we do encourage other technologists to develop new ideas and new technologies and then prove them out in transportation context, in a transportation environment. That's, I think, our secret sauce, if you will.
And you know, Vince highlights the IMI request for proposals has these three elements, right? And so there's automation, which is actually an area where, while FTA may not have tremendous resources, Vince and his team have worked where there are broader DOT, FHWA, or research resources available to make sure transit is at the table for those automation conversations. There's another element that's the mobility on demand element, that it's modeled on the mobility on demand. You can look at some of the mobility on demand demonstrations we're funding today, but we're looking at those, but also new concepts you all might identify. And then that third leg is the fare payment, because there's such a tremendous opportunity right now to give passengers better information and to simplify their transactions and their fare payment from the start of their trip to the finish of their trip. So those are the three buckets in terms of automation, mobility on demand, and fare payment. And we're kind of leaving it open-ended, as Vince highlights, so that you can fill in some of the blanks. The private sector folks, the transit agency folks, identifying the opportunities and bringing them to us to experiment.
To be a little bit more explicit, too, about the funding, so the mobility on demand part of the IMI is $8 million. Automation is $5 million, $3 million for driver assistance, and $2 million for circulator or shuttle service. And then there's $2 million for the MPI, for the multimodal payment initiative part of it. But again, we're encouraging people to column A, column B, column C, and put together a creative approach or a creative proposal based on the availability of those three pods.
Thank you, gentlemen. I have a quick question for you. So in your opinion, what is the vision for the future of mobility from the FTA perspective when it comes to freedom of movement for your average resident across the country?
You know, I think if you were at the session this morning, at the general session where Jarrett Walker was talking, he was talking about the opportunities we have to give people really high capacity service, right? The kind of service that generates ridership. But then at the same time, we want to be sure that people in our community, maybe they're not in high frequency corridors, also have some access, some basic level of mobility, right? And I think our program, that we carry out a statutory program, and carrying out that statutory program, it gives us resources to do both of those things, really giving you all the money so that in your community you can tailor that. So I would suggest there's not a national answer to that question. I think each community crafts its own solutions and finds the right balance, but we have endeavored to ensure that our program allows you to decide, you know, we're going to run, you know, high quality bus service in these key corridors, and we're going to grow our community around these transit-oriented corridors, and we're also going to have resources to ensure mobility for people who might not be able to use that fixed route service. Yeah.
Thank you.
So one issue of concern that our members were discussing over the weekend was the concern about the Highway Trust Fund solvency, and particularly the applicability of the Rostenkowski Test, which could lead to a 12% cut in the formula apportionments on October 1st with the FY 2020 Fast Act kind of contract authority levels. It's creating a lot of uncertainty among our members in terms of what will happen in terms of the funding. Can you give us DOT's perspective on that and how you think things will proceed kind of coming up to that date?
Yeah. So,
I'm sorry. And I'm Ward McCarriger with the APTA Government Affairs staff.
Thank you, Ward. So maybe not everybody's heard of the Rostenkowski Test. In federal law, there's a provision that says, I won't go into it in great detail, but it basically looks ahead at what the balances of the mass transit account of the Highway Trust Fund will be in the future. And it needs to stay above a certain level for us to maintain our program funding at the levels that are authorized. And so the Treasury Department does estimates, and their last estimate, which is at the end of March, said, hey, you know what, during fiscal year 2020, the upcoming fiscal year, the transit account might go below the necessary threshold to maintain the programs at the current levels. And it's really on a razor's edge because the dollar amounts involved, depending on what the Treasury estimate is, it could be okay, it could be off. So if you all go drive a lot and generate more gas tax revenue, we could be fine. But to not be glib about it, it's important because this calculation, as Ward's highlighting, under the worst case scenario, could result in a reduction in the amount apportioned for FTA programs, and that Congress wouldn't be able to, we'd get the money, but we wouldn't be able to allocate all of it in apportionment. There are a few paths forward, to be clear. We're looking at DOT, at what any executive branch solutions might be. It appears that most of the solutions reside with the legislative branch, and we've had conversations with the appropriators, with the authorizers, exploring what some of the paths forward might be. And I would anticipate we may see some action by the Congress to address this in the coming weeks or months. There's a similar test on the federal highway account of the Highway Trust Fund. And that program is also forecast not next fiscal year, but in the not too distant future to experience a similar set of circumstances. So the Congress may be looking at, some global solutions. We'll see where we land. But it is something that you should all be aware of. You can all, discuss with your elected officials, what your preferred approach is going forward.
Hi, folks. I'll throw a question out to highlight something that I think is worthy of highlight. We had a meeting over the lunch hour today. Vince was there, and it's on one of your notices that looks at the NTD reporting issues. And it's something under the radar, but it's bread and butter, and it's going to affect apportionments and what everyone gets. So I thought I would use the occasion to highlight that and ask your comment on it. There's an NTD notice that would ask sort of how TNC trips that are in partnership and collaboration with the transit agency should be interpreted and collected and gathered and by inference interpreted by the NTD in the distribution of funds. And also there was an automation comes into that too, as transit services are automated. How should the NTD interpret automated transit trips? Perhaps fixed guideway, perhaps not, perhaps something in between.
Yeah, so as Art's noting, our National Transit Database team, I think in conversation with all of you, has recognized how the world is changing. They're recognizing that the services that you fund may or may not be captured appropriately in the National Transit Database reporting that you provide. And then when you provide it to us, are we collecting it in the right manner, and does it inform the allocation of funds in a way that makes sense? So right now we do have on the street for notice and comment a proposed approach for a National Transit Database reporting. I'd encourage you all to take a look at that. You can think about how it would play out for your agency, and we are looking for comment. Our staff, our team takes those comments. They summarize them. We sit down with our administrator at what we call our policy council meetings, and we talk about the feedback that we've received from the industry and about what the right approach is going forward. So I don't know offhand what the closing date for that NOFO is.
June 9th.
Or June 9th, thank you. It's not a NOFO, it's a request for comment. So I would encourage people to look at that FTA Federal Register notice related to the National Transit Database with comments due June 9th.
And if TNCs, for example, would be recognized under what conditions and what kind of framework and parameters. So those are all the kinds of things that everyone should be thinking about commenting on.
They are, yeah, you know, it highlights our, as I was talking about, you know, what is public transportation, and there's what I might think of as public transportation or what you might think of as public transportation, and there's what the federal law in terms of FTA funding eligibility says is public transportation. And again, it's, you know, people sharing rides on regular service that's available to everybody in the public. And so, you know, is a single passenger trip in a sedan public transportation? Is carpooling in a sedan public transportation? Is it public transportation if I'm sharing a ride with somebody, but the vehicle isn't open to other people, right? So those are the kind of questions that are engaged by the mobility conference conversation. And again, our NTD team had heard from all of you, and they said, let's put this out to everybody and see what we get.
So everywhere you look, automation is a hot topic in every industry, and certainly transportation is no exception. So given the breakthroughs in self-driving technology, what do you see as the challenges and the opportunities on the public transportation side?
I think from the perspective of automation in a transit environment, I can see a future where there is probably increased mobility, increased efficiency. There is also the idea of just an optimized network of transportation options with automation as well. Certainly, bottom line, safety would be improved through an automation environment. And so I see a lot of potential in increasing what is already a very safe industry, but improving that kind of operational environment. Obviously, there are also the issue of hostling and perhaps depot maneuvering and bus washes and all of that activity that goes on transit agency properties could stand to be also improved through that as well, made much more efficient.
Public transportation has been a really good test bed for certain technologies over time. Think about vehicle propulsion as an example in the past. And when it comes to automation, a lot of you have transit facilities that lend themselves to automation testing. Think of BRT fixed guideway corridors. You saw an example of that in one of the videos, I think maybe out in Eugene. And so that's an opportunity where transit can be a leader. I think on the human side, I think people always think about there's hundreds of thousands of people who are vehicle operators. And what we were reminded of this morning is that vehicle operators, they operate the vehicle. They're also providing other roles while they're on the bus with their passengers, with the customers of the transit services. And I think Secretary Chow, as a former Secretary of Labor, has spoken about her interest in making sure that people who are in those roles, that we are thinking about the training and the opportunities for those folks as we go forward as well. I think that's something that we all need to bear in mind in our industry, where those are a substantial share of the people in our industry.
Thank you. We have another question in the back.
Good afternoon. I'm Charlie Nelson, working with the Western Reserve Transit Authority in Youngstown, Ohio. We are one of the 3 build grant awards that include autonomous vehicles. The contract from DOT is going to go through Federal Highway Administration because there are street improvements associated with it that are a higher percentage of the budget. But the transit system will be responsible for the operation, purchase, turnkey, whatever, for the autonomous vehicles. Mm-hmm. We are already thinking about a system of routes in the downtown area supported by autonomous vehicles. The Youngstown State University is right at the edge. The major health institution is a little bit further away. Those will be connected through the build grant. Our hub is right there. We learned just recently that another transit system received some CMAQ money for the purchase of autonomous vehicles and was told that a transfer to FTA would not be successful, that FTA could not fund autonomous vehicles. Do you have any insight on that? Because that doesn't square with where we want to go, and maybe it's just a matter of struggling with the pace of whatever.
There's potentially a few layers to it, and we should get together with Kelly Brookins, our regional administrator for Ohio, and Vince, and talk through some of the elements. It is notable, right? So through the build grants and potentially through some FTA grants, there is eligibility to fund autonomous vehicles. There may be a flex fund issue we need to sort out as well. But it is worth highlighting in this conversation, vehicles that are autonomous right now, some of them are being demonstrated on private roadways, say in an office park. And then there are vehicles that in the future or today are eligible because they meet the NHTSA standards to operate on public roads. And so I would suggest if you, as a transit agency official, are contemplating implementing autonomous vehicles on your system, have a conversation with FTA early on, and we can provide you with some framework about vehicle procurement or vehicle specs that will fulfill NHTSA requirements, fulfill grant eligibility. But if you would, when we're done, we can follow up and continue the conversation.
Thank you.
Yep.
All right, Peter Varga again. I'm the board member for APTA representing designated the legislative committee, so we've been working on the reauthorization proposal. And that's one of the questions that I really wanted to ask here today was, for the FAST Act reauthorization, have you begun identifying programs or policies for tweaks or even for major changes?
So for this, and this goes across administrations, whenever there's a reauthorization coming up, there's a lot of things we can't predict. We do know when an authorization period is going to conclude. And so at FTA, we undertake an effort typically to look at what's in the current law, what's needed for the future. You all are doing that at APT as well. So we've been listening to our stakeholders. I think we're going to be doing some more of that in the weeks and months ahead as you all are finalizing some of your approaches to it. So we've been good listeners. We do have a team. Our policy director, Adam Shilga, has led an effort at FTA, which is an internal effort right now, so I don't have anything to report to a broad public group today, but where we've been thinking about some of the usual questions that come up during reauthorization, right? So every reauthorization, every administration, the Congress, ask really basic questions, right? What do we need for the future? Who needs those things for the future? What's the amount that we need? If we know the amount that we need, who's going to pay for it, right? These are just basic distributional questions. And so we've thought about some of those questions at a really high level. We have thought about programmatic design issues, right? What's the right balance between state of good repair investments and investing for future growth? That's an evergreen topic, right? So we've had some of those conversations. I think we're paying attention to APTA, AASHTO, CTAA, AMPO, all the stakeholder organizations to understand the viewpoints that you're bringing together, and that's going to inform what we do. And then as we go forward, usually, we'll talk about, are there principles that an administration will want to articulate? Are there principles and some program features? Are there principles, program features, and statutory text? And that's something that we're going to be sorting out in the future. So we have put some thought into some of the program design questions. We've been listening to all of you as we do that. And I would think in the months ahead, we'll have some more to say coming from USDOT.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Peter.
All right, we have time for a few more questions. Anything burning on your mind? Now's your chance.
We've exhausted them.
Given them all the answers.
I would put in a plug. Tomorrow we have a number of sessions. I may not capture all of them off the top of my head, but we have a lot of our FTA leadership team and subject matter experts in the house here. And so James Harper, our Director of Procurement, is participating in a session. I know Mishadoni Smith, who leads our Transit Asset Management Program, is leading a session. Keisha Spaulding, there's a session you're participating in that's on transit training. There's another session on transit safety management systems and our Public Transportation Agency safety plan, where Paulina Orchard will be speaking. Have I missed any? And Pete, you're doing a session on BRT and the Capital Investment Grant Program tomorrow afternoon. So there's a number of instances where we've got some of our FTA team here providing you with some timely updates. I know that yesterday, Scott, you delivered a session on the top 10 triennial review findings, and I find that that's one of the most popular presentations anybody at FTA makes, because it provides people with some real-world information you can use to make sure you're prepared as you go forward for triennial reviews.
Any last thoughts or words of wisdom as we go forward through the reauthorization process and the brave new world of new mobility?
Stay engaged. You never know when the sort of window of opportunity for good things to happen will occur. And so I think for all of us, we want to stay in communication, stay engaged, and make sure we make progress. I appreciate the opportunity to talk to all of you today.
Really great advice. So if there are no more questions, we're going to close out today's session. And please join me in thanking Vince and Matt for their time and their candor and their open conversation. We very much appreciate the time you spend with us, and it helps all of us be better, so thank you.